All right, hi everybody, welcome back. Thanks for joining us for this session titled Forensic Anthropology and the Shortcomings of Sex Estimation. The three of us presenting today are professional anthropologists located at Idaho State University, that's Sam Blatt, Texas Tech University, that's Mari, and my name is Amy and I'm at the University of New Hampshire. So in this presentation, we're going to explore concepts of biological sex and gender identity and typical skeletal features used in sex estimation. So we emphasize throughout this presentation that sex and gender cannot be conflated. In doing so, or ignoring gender diversity in forensic cases is detrimental to the overall goal of forensic anthropology, which is the identification of decedents and return of remains. So in cold cases, especially those involving skeletonized remains, anthropologists are in professional positions to directly confront potential as well as to have those important conversations that Jesse outlined too, and have those conversations with medical, legal investigators and law enforcement by providing information about cultural context, of course, something that we as anthropologists think about a lot. Oh, Mari, can you advance me? I don't know that I can do, thank you. So before we start, we just want to note that there will be images of human remains in this presentation. All of the images are from public websites. And so we use all these images here, of course, in the spirit of teaching and learning. So the anthropologists listening on the call today will be really familiar with the biological profile, but there are a lot of students here and maybe members of other disciplines. So let us quickly explain the utility of the bioprofile in forensic anthropology. Using those patterns in size and shape in the skeleton, anthropologists can estimate, right, not determine, but estimate age, sex, ancestry, and stature from the human skeleton. So clearly each of these components is really useful when investigating a case of an unknown person. Creating a biological profile, of course, also helps law enforcement narrow down their potential matches list. And if the decedent was reported missing, law enforcement can work with the biological profile generated by the anthropologists to match missing persons to the potential unknown decedent. So our goal with the creation of the bioprofile is always to provide relevant information to compare to whatever information is known, such as missing persons reports, NamUs profiles, and incident reports. So sex and gender are different aspects of human variation, and they're not synonymous terms, right? So Lee and Anthony really nicely laid this out in a couple presentations before this. But interchanging these words is really unhelpful in forensic casework, and it doesn't reflect the cultural and biological realities of sex estimation and gender identity. Forensic anthropologists are really uniquely suited to address the non-binary and diverse nature of both sex and gender. So the term non-binary here means that both sex and gender exists on a spectrum or a continuum, while the qualifier diverse in our case means that there are many different expressions of sex and even more expressions of gender. A critical piece to underscore here too, and I know that folks who teach osteology talk about this probably all the time, is that skeletal remains have no gender. Anthropologists can really only interpret gender based on context clues, but in reality, we only know about a person's gender after they've been identified, and we learn a little bit more about their life. So more on that in a couple slides. Sex refers to a biological classification of an organism as male or female based on genotype or genetic makeup, phenotype or physical characteristics that we can see, and based on reproductive organs and their functions. And so when we estimate sex in forensic anthropology, we're making a biological classification based on our reading of physical characteristics in the skeleton. And we can estimate sex from skeletal remains because there are known patterns, of course, in shape and size that allow us to group unknown individuals as probable males or probable females. Traditionally, then, when we think about biological sex, we're considering individuals to be male or female. Those of you who have been with us since the beginning of the webinar, this slide should look familiar. Anthony had this in an earlier presentation, and I stole it because I think it's really important. I stole the next one from him too. But the biological non-binary reality is that there are, at least 47 various sex presentations. and the variable presentations of an individual's chromosomes, their genes, their hormones, their internal and external sex organs, and secondary sex characteristics contribute to this overall more complex reality. And the stats presented on this slide, I think, specifically underscore the non-binary nature of biological sex. So if you travel towards the bottom, you'll see a couple different statistics here that I think are important to highlight again during this webinar. First, the total number of people whose bodies differ from our idea of this kind of Western cultural standard of male or female presentation are roughly 1 in 100 births. So, oh, I'm getting my internet's unstable sign, or it's hopefully I'm back. Surgical intervention then focused on quote unquote normalizing genital appearance occurs in about 1 to 2 births out of every 1,000 births. So, you know, in response to this, there's a growing intersex activism community here in the States who are really vocal about the harmful effects of medical intervention for these individuals. And they're doing their work in the context of these statistics. So as forensic scientists, you need to be aware of these too. So to put this biological sex diversity into perspective, again, grab this slide from Anthony, so a little bit repetitive here, but if you missed it the first time, I think this does kind of put biological sex diversity into perspective. It's estimated that 1 to 2% of the US population are intersex, which interestingly is about the same percentage of redheads in the country. So theoretically, when we're thinking about scaling biological sex diversity, which is something we of course can't know about people unless they share it with us, when we scale that to something we're all familiar with, which is, you know, a person with red hair, we see how many people that we're potentially missing when we reduce sex estimation to a binary division of male or female. So moving on from sex, I'm going to briefly define gender, and then Sam and Mari are going to go much further into this. But gender refers to an individual's identity or social role. And so, of course, when we're teaching this or when we're reading about it or when we're writing about gender, we're describing it on sort of a masculine, feminine continuum. So an individual might see themselves really clearly on either end of this continuum or maybe somewhere in the middle, or, you know, some fluidity on that continuum. In human society, we tend to have different expectations, of course, for how men and boys and women and girls might act and dress, what professions they'll have interest, maybe what music they listen to, how or if they will parent. But, you know, as anthropologists, we know that these ideas of gender are not universal. And so while this idea that there are more than 2 genders is slowly gaining, you know, mainstream recognition here in the States, of course, it's not a new idea to many cultures around the world, including cultures within the United States. It's not a new idea to many cultures past and present, who have long recognized multiple gender roles and identities, as well as gender fluidity across the lifespan. So unlike sex, which we can usually fairly accurately estimate in the skeleton, we just cannot read gender from a person's bones. Remember, if we're thinking that gender is all about how a person saw themselves and how they existed in the world, right, the skeleton can't really tell us anything about that. So as a reminder, we can really only know about gender once the person has been positively identified and we learn more about their life. What we can do, though, is understand that gender is fluid, and we can evaluate cultural clues collected at the scene or through investigation and let those clues in part guide us. And some of the anthropologists on the call now might have, you know, case examples of this in their own work. So this individual, who was formerly known as Live Oak Doe, whose name is being withheld, was actually identified earlier this year by the DNA Doe Project after their case was discovered and researched by the Transgender Task Force. This person had 4 piercings in each ear and was dressed in what could be described as feminine clothing when discovered. However, their biological sex appeared to be male, and there was no evidence of gender-affirming surgery. So this suggests that this individual's gender may have been fluid in some way, and therefore our skeletal assessment should be used with caution. You know, perhaps this is a person who dressed in drag but saw themselves as a man. Perhaps they identified as a woman and didn't feel the need for surgery or potentially couldn't afford the cost. Quick note here, of course, that surgery is not, of course, part of everyone's transition. So the point here with live Oak Doe is that we don't know how this person identified, and that's why I keep referring to them instead of him or her. And honestly, of course, this is not a matter of political correctness, but we need to recognize that word choices have consequences for whether or not a person gets identified. So if we decide to prioritize biological sex here, even though the clues are telling us that this person could have identified otherwise, or potentially excluding missing persons report in which this person was reported as female. And if we decide to assume this person identified as a woman, we're potentially excluding missing persons reports in which they were reported as male. So understanding the complexities in sex estimation and gender identity is absolutely critical for forensic anthropologists. Conflation of these terms in the case file and in the media can have dire consequences. So an example of this, although there are many, and I'm sure Jesse could tell us about so many more. I actually learned about Sage Smith through Jesse. So the case of Sage Smith, unfortunately, who is still missing. Sage is a trans woman, and you can see from the missing persons flyer that she was dead named and misgendered on this flyer. So reporting dead names and using old photos really does not honor a missing person or victim's memory, and it certainly doesn't help to identify a person or catch a perpetrator.
So now that we've touched on the biological sex and meaning of gender identity, let's turn to how forensic anthropologists actually estimate a person's biological sex from the skeleton. So despite the intricacies of sex and gender, why is it that in most cases we actually can estimate sex from the skeleton with reasonable accuracy? The answer is sexual dimorphism, and sexual dimorphism refers to the phenomenon that males and females of the same species typically exhibit different physical characteristics to go beyond the differences in their genetic makeup or reproductive organs. If you've ever been on a trip to the zoo, you've probably seen examples of this. Some of the differences are in size, like the differences in the male and female orangutans here, or differences in shape or color, like the differences between the plumage of the peacocks compared to peahens. The sexually dimorphic traits are expressed as morphological traits in the skeleton, and generally males are larger and more robust or more heavily built than females, but this is with substantial overlap between the dimensions of both sexes. So for example, in humans, males are on average 8% larger than females and have larger muscle attachment sites on their bones. So size, robusticity, and architecture of bones of males and females can be sexually dimorphic. So when using the skeleton to estimate sex, what are we really looking at? Shape of bone generally follows the way in which it is used or its function. However, the shape is not a reflection of gender, since as discussed, gender is not biological. In forensic anthropology, the shape of bony features are evaluated based on continuous spectrum or range of variation, and then estimating where a particular individual lies along that continuum. Many of the features we use to estimate sex do not develop until after puberty in response to hormone changes in the body. This is why we typically do not estimate sex from subadult or children's skeletons, because children do not display the level of sexual dimorphism needed to accurately estimate sex. So this photo of Brad Pitt is a good example here. You can see how his face changed from when he was a teenager until now. As an adult, he has much more strongly expressed male features, and his skeleton, we would see this reflected through the development of large muscle attachments across his skull. So this brings us to how we actually measure sexual dimorphism. There are two general type of methods, metric or quantitative methods, and morphological or qualitative methods. Metric refers to measurement with numbers. These methods involve taking calipers or other instruments and coming up with a numerical measurement of a bone or a part of a bone. And these measurements can then be compared against measurements of known male or female skeletons. But morphological refers to assessments based on shape, and these methods involve looking at bony features and assigning it to a score or a number along a sliding scale of traits that are more male or more female appearing, and lower scores typically reflect female expressions, while higher scores typically reflect male expressions of a feature. Forensic anthropologists compare cases to data banks of metrics and non-metrics of individuals with known sex and ancestry and use statistics like discriminant function in various softwares to statistically compare and estimate components of the biological profile, including sex. So the next question is, where do we look or measure on the skeleton? And we can look at various parts of the skeleton to estimate sex, but some of the most important areas of interest in sex estimation are the pelvis, the skull, and the long bones. So the pelvis is the most accurate region in the skeleton to estimate sex, and some studies have shown up to 95% accuracy. I want you to look for a moment at this picture. Maybe looking at these two pelvises next to each other will give you a good example of what we're talking about for sexual dimorphism. Which one do you think is male or female? Go ahead and write that real quick in the chat if you like, and think about why you came to that conclusion. So, and just to throw the answer out there fast, if you guessed that the left one is female and the right is male, you are correct. Female skeletons are adapted to childbearing. And so every part of the pelvis structure in female exhibits features that make the pelvic inlet, indicated by the red circles here, just a little bit bigger to accommodate that. And some other differences include the breadth of the pelvis and associated anatomy, such as the sciatic notch, which is indicated by the arrow. And here's just one more example of from the pelvis, though there are others. Here you can see what are called the ventral arc and the subpubic angle of the pelvis. And in the top left corner of the slide, there is a photo of the whole pelvis with the location we're talking about right now that's circled in red. And notice how in females represented on the left side, there is a concave arc indicated in red that the bridge of bone forming the arc is narrow and more fragile looking. And as you move to the right, you gradually see the arc become more and more convex and dense and thicker, representing a more and more male morphology closer to the score of 5. So here's an example of a qualitative method for sex estimation from the skull. Keep in mind that the skull and pelvis both have qualitative and quantitative methods associated. So using this method, just like the pelvis, different locations on the skull are scored on a scale of 1 through 5. And you should be getting a sense now of how scaling traits can be dependent on observer experience, and that many individuals may score as 3s, leading to an uncertain sex estimation. So notice the skulls on the slide. The top, the female, is more rounded, smaller, more gracile, and the lower, the male, is more robust, larger, and has stronger muscle attachments. And finally, we have also sex estimation using long bones, especially measurements of the long bones of the limbs. So how this works is that joint surfaces, like the head of the femur here, indicated by the arrow, are sexually dimorphic. Males tend to have much larger joints than females. And we can take measures of this area, like the maximum diameter, to help us quantify these differences and estimate sex using skeletons with known sex. And this can be done for other joints as well. So if you were to make a graph of any skeletal measurement, you would probably get something like this. And the majority of female measurements would fall into a particular range, and the majority of male measurements would fall to another particular range. And each sex would have their averages and their extremes. And the ranges between the sexes would overlap, but there would be a certain point that divides most males and most females, and this is called the sectioning point. And if a skeletal measurement of an unidentified individual falls on one side, they are more likely female. And if it falls the other side of the sectioning point, they're more likely male. If they fall somewhere in the middle of the two, sex is indeterminate. So you may be wondering, what would the skeletons of transgender individuals look like? The short answer is that a trans person would likely retain the skeletal characteristics of their biological sex before transitioning, but there are some potential exceptions. So as part of their transition, some transgender people undergo treatments such as gender affirming surgeries, cosmetic procedures, feminizing or masculinizing hormone therapy to achieve gender congruence, the matching of gender identity and physical appearance. And surgeries and less invasive cosmetic procedures can change the appearance of an individual's sex characteristics to better reflect their gender identity, and can also induce physical changes in the body caused by the female or male hormones during puberty to help promote gender congruence. About 49% of transgender individuals have undergone hormone therapies. In general, the long-term effects of gender-affirming hormones is unknown, and studies are conflicting. And some research has reported lower bone mass hormones in trans women, Others have reported increased bone mineral density in both trans men and women. Only about 25% of trans individuals undergo gender affirming surgery. So most of the surgeries alter breasts or sex organs or other soft tissue not visible in the skeleton. And only 7% of trans women have had facial feminization surgery, which is apparent in the skeleton, but it's been reported that over 43% want that surgery. Less is known about facial masculinization surgery. So very simplistically, both surgeries alter the shape and size in areas of forehead, brows, cheeks, nose, jaws, depending on the patient. And as forensic anthropologists use measures of the skull to statistically discern sex, it's important to investigate whether or not gender affirming surgeries alter morphology significantly enough to result in a change of sex estimation. So Shaw et al. In 2020 examined pre and post operative cranial measurements of 11 trans women from CT scans, and the authors found that all but one cranium classified as male preoperatively was also classified as male post-surgery. Nevertheless, surgical implants and alterations are likely to be identifiable in skeletal remains in many surgeries that are most common or exclusive to gender affirming surgeries, allowing for the forensic anthropologist to infer gender from those contexts. More on this later with Taylor though. So, and more in session 5, I should say. So sex estimation overall is very useful in analysis in forensic cold cases. It provides an accurate sex estimation of an unidentified decedent, significantly reduces the pool 50%. And estimating sex is also important to then being able to accurately estimate other parts of the biological profile first, including ancestry and age and stature. However, it is important to recognize and understand the limitations of sex estimation methods and to understand that anthropological methods alone are not sufficient to achieve identification. So as we've discussed, methods are based on variation in human biology and can only address biological sex. They cannot address how a person is identified in life or how they were known to their family and friends. And skeletal shape or morphology is not reflective of gender identity, and chromosomes are not reflective of gender identity. Even beyond this point, expression of skeletal sex traits of biological males and females can also vary depending on both the population of origin, geographic location, time period, even within the same population. This is called secular change. And we don't have population-specific methods for every group of humans on Earth. So this means that there can be unknown error rates in sex estimation among populations. So even if we put away gender identity for a moment and focus only on biological sex, we still face methodological limitations. Our best estimation methods are often very accurate, but none are 100%. And these numbers reflect the best case scenarios for accuracy of sex estimation based on various skeletal elements, and using more than one element is best if possible. And so it's important to understand and acknowledge that in a small number of cases, our methods are not actually going to get biological sex right or in confirmation with DNA results.
So the reason that we don't always get biological sex estimates right is because, as we've discussed, human biological variation just doesn't exist as a binary. As we've seen, the shapes and the sizes of our bones don't really fit neatly into one category or another because they're expressions along a continuum of variation. We've discussed some typical male and female expressions of a specific features, but as we also saw, there's a lot of variation that exists in the middle of that spectrum. Let's compare this reality to our biological methods, which are designed based on the assumption that all individuals can be placed into one of two categories, male or female. In making this division, biological methods are splitting the continuum of variation down the middle. And these methods are not really able to address the nuance of intermediate expressions, which means that those who are in the middle may be left out or misclassified. For example, we don't have skeletal methods for estimating intersex or identifying intersex individuals. I will add the caveat that it's not clear that it would be ever possible or advisable to create such methods for various reasons that Anthony discussed in session 2. What we hope that you do take away from our various sessions today is that binary categories do not necessarily represent the variation in either sex or gender that we might see in our forensic cases. So in other words, applying categories such as male or female, or labeling our unidentified does as Jane or John may be accurate and useful for many or even most decedents, but it's not necessarily going to be accurate for everyone. Earlier, we discussed that some trans people seek gender-affirming medical care as part of their transition, and that changes to the skeleton that are associated with hormone therapies or gender-affirming surgery may reflect skeletal correlates of transgender. But as much as we anthropologists really love to look for solutions through skeletal research, we also need to acknowledge that focusing on skeletal correlates of gender identity is inherently limited. These treatments are expensive and therefore cost prohibitive to many trans people who already face economic hardship due to discrimination. There's also various risks to health and quality of life that are associated with medical transition, and many people might be unwilling to accept those. And finally, some trans people choose not to transition medically because they don't want to or they don't feel they need to. It doesn't define how they see themselves, and it's not necessarily important to their personal identity or self-conception. So to kind of summarize our thoughts on that, skeletal correlates of gender-affirming medical care may present useful evidence as to potential gender identity, but we can't define trans identity or based on drugs or surgery or focus our identification efforts on those who have undergone these procedures, because doing so would be classist. These are expensive avenues, and reductionist, because they're not reflective of all transgender experiences and identities. So this brings us to another point about limitations in evaluating sex and gender in forensic cases. Gender expression is fluid. It's just not possible to know a person's gender identity based on their physical appearance, including whether they had surgery, how they wore their hair, or what they were wearing. There exists a great diversity of gender identities and a great diversity in how individuals express their gender identity. And a person's presentation may also depend on the context. To give just one example, in some situations, it might not be safe for a person to dress in a way that matches their gender identity. Ultimately, we can't know a decedent's gender for certain until that person has been positively ID'd and we can confirm how they identified in life. But what we can do is consider all available evidence, including estimating biological sex and documenting context clues like masculine and feminine clothing, personal effects, or evidence of past surgery. Taken together, this information might signal that a decedent was potentially transgender or gender variant, and that their case may require some specialized care. So finally, another limitation we should be aware of is the potential for cognitive bias to influence biological sex estimation. Cognitive bias is a form of bias that occurs when a person's subjective construction of reality causes faulty ways of thinking. Studies have shown that when given certain contextual information, even experienced analysts provide incorrect conclusions to support the evidence that they were given. One example of how cognitive bias can influence sex estimation is the case of Julie Doe. Many of you are probably familiar with this case, but for those of you who aren't, in the 1980s, a body was found in a wooded area in Florida, dressed in a denim skirt and a tank top. The investigators on this case noted long manicured fingernails, long bleach blonde hair, and silicone breast implants. The case was declared a Jane Doe and taken to an anthropology lab for assessment of biological profile. And the anthropologists on the case assessed the skeletal remains and estimated the sex to be female. Person was 24 to 32 years old, about 5'10" tall with an athletic build, and with evidence of rhinoplasty. The anthropologist noted pits and ridges in the pelvis, which he attributed to hormone changes associated with childbirth, and determined that this individual had probably given birth. When anthropologists went back and analyzed those bones 30 years later, without being given any of that contextual information about the decedent's clothing or appearance, they estimated the sex to be pretty clearly male. And DNA analysis confirmed that there were XY chromosomes. After this individual was named Julie Doe after a character in an LGBT film, and the case is still being investigated. But the reason for bringing up Julie's case is to show how the original anthropologist may have been unintentionally biased in his biological sex estimation after being exposed to contextual information about the decedent's gendered presentation, including feminine clothing, hair, nails, and breast implants. This case shows how both biological sex and contextual evidence are relevant and important to report accurately. In Julie's case, the discordance between biological sex and gender presentation suggests that the decedent could have been a transgender woman, which is an important clue that might have helped solve the case back in the 1980s. So in closing, these are the things that we hope that you take away from this session. Skeletal methods very often provide accurate estimates of biological sex, but it is important to recognize the limitations of these methods. Importantly, they don't estimate sex accurately in 100% of cases, and they just can't address gender. The skeleton can potentially record information that is relevant to a person's gender, such as evidence of gender-affirming surgery or hormone therapy, but this too has its limits because not all trans people will medically transition, and much is still unknown about how these treatments affect the skeleton. Therefore, it's important to be clear and transparent about the limitations of skeletal methods when we communicate with law enforcement and death investigators and anyone else who might be investigating these cases. This can be as simple as having a candid conversation about what our methods can and can't tell us, what is and isn't possible to know about someone's identity from their remains, and how the information we provide should be used in subsequent investigation. We also want to emphasize that both context clues and biological sex may present relevant information for a case, but it's important to be aware that exposure to contextual information can introduce cognitive bias and potentially influence skeletal or other forensic analyses. So blind analyses, where the analyst doesn't initially have access to the contextual information, may be useful to combat this potential bias. And finally, it's important to understand that anthropological methods alone are not always going to be sufficient to achieve identification. Sex is often seen as one of the most basic components of the biological profile, but this may not necessarily be enough to identify someone if the appearance of their skeleton or their biological sex didn't match their lived identity. Alternative strategies such as gender-informed forensic genetic genealogy may help resolve these cases. And we will hear more about these strategies and some casework examples from Anthony and Lee Redgrave in session 6. We have various references, and I hope that we have time for some questions. Gotta find them.
Do we want to have Taylor, if Taylor can unmute to answer the question that's in the Q&A? I think that might go most closely with her research.
Yeah,
or
so
we can save it.
I was looking at it and I don't know the answer. I'm not sure if people who medically transition experience those same average lifespans. So I would have to look into that more before being able to give an answer. I'm not sure.
I can give a really brief answer from my perspective as a trans person. What I can say is that I actually asked my doctor specifically about that when I started hormones, and what he told me was that he didn't know. I can tell you that there are certain aspects of specifically gender affirming hormones that can affect things like red blood cell count, blood pressure, and liver function and things like that. So that might have an effect on longevity for factors such as that. But I don't think there's any data on it in regards to trans women.
Mm-hmm. And conversely, you also have to take into consideration the positive effect on the possible positive effect on physical health that a positive effect on mental health can have. So if you mentally feel better on hormones as a trans person, that's going to maybe positively affect your health. And I don't think that's something that's been studied yet either. So, and of course, studying these things is, ethically weird and has to be carefully considered. So that's probably also why there's not a whole lot of data yet.
Yeah, so by the way, we have about, wait, are we at time now? Let's see. Yeah, we're at time for the end of this session, but if there's any more questions coming in, we can answer those and then take a little break.
Yeah, it looks like there's one more question that just popped up into the chat if you guys have time to try and answer that.
Sorry, technical difficulties. Let's see. Looking for the question. Okay, Kate is asking, is anyone developing standardized language to use in forensic anthropology case reports that would address these issues with methods for sex estimation? This is another question that I don't personally know the answer to. I'm not aware of anyone addressing issues with specifically with methods, or oh, I see. Is the question, do you mean like what can we put in our case reports? I know that for example, in forensic anthropology, the way that anthropologists understand the perimortem interval, how we understand being able to see skeletal trauma that's occurring at or around the time of death is different than how forensic pathologists see that. So we often include a footnote in case notes. I know many of us put footnotes in our case reports about how forensic anthropologists understand perimortem trauma to be defined. And so I could see something parallel being generated for something that we could add to our case reports to explain the limitations of sex estimation methods, as well as the differences between sex and gender, but I am not aware of anyone who's done that yet. If I'm wrong, somebody in the audience, I know we have a lot of forensic anthropologists with us, so please throw that in the chat if you do happen to know the answer to that. Thanks, Kate.
And I think this other new question we'll leave for Taylor in the next session.
I just want to really quickly say to shout out Fatima. I don't know if she's on the call or not, but I know that she does some work around like language use in case reports. And that's a really good question because I've gotten it privately several times. I know Mari and I have had this conversation too. So that might be something that Anthro's on the call we could collaborate on and think about further.
Yeah,
Yes.
I'll highlight a paper in the next session that offers guidelines for transgender health research, and they include a section on what language to use.
Thank you, everyone. I think we'll get ready for the next session.